Hello, Adrian. Welcome to my channel. We've got lots to talk about and a short space of time to get the questions in. But before we start, how have you been keeping and how have you been spending your time?
Yes, not too bad, thanks. We're lucky enough to have lots of nice open space around here, so we're managing to get out and walk and cycle a lot, which has been quite good fun. With two children, trying to homeschool one and looking after a preschooler as well, has been a busy time actually. Not enough time for photography really, but the kids are important, so that's just had to take a bit of a back seat in the last few weeks.
So I think we shot a couple of times. We shot in Shanghai. I definitely remember that because we went an hour's drive outside of the city to a small town where no one spoke English. And I think we also shot at your house in your home studio and also around that location. Can you remember that?
Yes, I do. The two shoots we did, one in Qibao near Shanghai, taught me a good lesson about photography there, and we had a good fun shoot in my studio as well, and out and about in Surrey. I enjoyed both of them very much.
I doubt that I taught you anything, but what do you remember from that day? I remember you walking around with a massive hat and you got loads of attention.
There was an old man had a really good face, and I was walking just ahead of you, and I saw him, and I wanted to take a picture of him, and I was going to ask him, and I decided not to, and I walked on, and I looked at some other things, and when we looked at our pictures together afterwards, you'd stopped and asked if you could take his photo, and he said yes, and you got a really fantastic portrait of him, and I really wish that I'd actually just taken the time to ask him, because the worst he could have said was no.
So, Adrian, let's get the show on the road. Let's tell everyone where you're from and a little bit about yourself.
I'm based in Surrey, just south of Farnham, and I am lucky enough to be able to travel quite a lot, so I shoot a fair bit of travel photography. My favourite things to shoot are wildlife portraits and landscape, and I also like to play with a little bit of time lapse, and recently I've been doing some astrophotography too.
So, Adrian, how long have you been a photographer?
I bought my first proper camera when I was 14, so since then really, so almost 30 years, although I have to say more seriously in the last 15 or so.
What's your passion when it comes to photography? What type of photography do you do?
I do a mixture of photography styles, but one of my favourite is portrait. I do love humans and the human body. I love faces and the shapes that you can make with people's bodies, and so I really enjoy the human aspect of photography.
Unlike photographing landscapes, seascapes, cityscapes, and inanimate objects, what kind of considerations do you have to make for shooting models?
There's lots of things to think about when you're shooting with another person. So I suppose if I just focus on three things. First of all, choose carefully. If there's some specific shot that you want, or something that you're trying to shoot, then make sure that you choose the right model for that. Secondly, communicate well. It's very important that everybody on the shoot knows what your artistic vision is and what you're expecting. So even things like times and places and what clothes to wear, try and be more rather than less specific to make sure that you're getting the shot that you want. And thirdly, I would say look after your model. It's the right thing to do with another person anyway, but your photography is going to be so much better if your model is happy and relaxed and feels safe. So even things like, I don't know, if you've got um, a stairway or something that you want the model to stand on, then make sure that it's safe to do so. If you want them to climb a tree or something, then make sure that you've got a way of getting up and down the tree okay, and something that you'd be happy to do yourself.
I think sometimes as photographers, we're so focused on trying to get the shot, trying to get the right light, the right poses, that we actually forget about the human side of the equation, and that's looking after the model. So I agree with everything you just said. Going on from that, one of the attributes of photography is creativity, seeing things in your mind, creating things in your mind, and then manifesting those things outwardly. Can creativity be learned?
I think it can. I think a lot of creativity is just about generating ideas and choosing the ones that you like. And so if you can find a way of generating ideas by looking at other people's work or talking to people, or actually really sitting down and considering what it is that you like about specific pictures that are your favourites, then you can start to work out the sort of styles and things that you like, and you can then generate options, and you'll discard some and you'll choose some, but then the ones that you choose, you've got a lot more variety, and that variety often drives creativity. And so I think if you do think about things and look around and really consider what it is that you like and the things it generates some options from that yes, you can teach yourself to be creative.
Well, there's hope for us all then if creativity can be learned. Some might have it in an abundance, others might have it in a lesser capacity, but we all can develop that creative side of us when it comes to photography. So let's move on and let's talk about, can you give three things that make a good photographer?
I would say observation, competence, and patience. So observation really speaks for itself. You need to be looking at things and not just looking at, say, a general scene or something, but look at the specific things in it. A good example of that is I have a picture I'm very proud of two chain links together, which were very cracked, very rusted and cracked. And together, the two chain links look really lovely with all the paths of the cracks on them. And they were taken. That picture was taken standing by the Golden Gate Bridge, and I was standing there, and lots of people were taking the sort of standard snap of the bridge and the locality. And I was looking around at some other things, and I found these beautiful, very big chains, and actually doing some very close-up macro photography of those chains was much more rewarding and interesting than taking a picture of the bridge, even though the bridge was a nice sight to see. And so for me, actually just looking at the little things around and looking at the environment around me and the things that I can use and trying to be creative with what I have in front of me rather than just looking at the scene as a whole is really helpful as a photographer. The second thing I mentioned was competence. You need to be competent with using your camera. That doesn't mean you have to be massively technical about things. It just means you have to know how to achieve what you want to get out of your camera. It doesn't matter what f-stop someone tells you to use or what shutter speed someone tells you to use. You should be getting what you want for your picture. And so if you've got that competence of being able to use the camera that you have, whatever camera it is, whether it's a mobile phone or a Phantom Flex for taking high-speed images, you just need to be competent with using the kit that you have. The last thing I mentioned was patience. And I think with a lot of pictures, you do have to be very patient. Some wildlife photographers spend years to get one shot. And if you're shooting landscape, you need to wait for the right light. And even if you're just taking a picture of a tourist attraction somewhere just to remember what you've been, sometimes even just the patience of being able to wait 20 or 30 seconds until a coach has driven out the way, or there's no cars in the way, or you've got the scene that you want, rather than just lifting up your camera, taking a picture and walking off again. Even just 10 or 20 seconds worth of patience, or sometimes many years of planning, but that patience will always help you to create better images.
Being a true professional photographer takes many hours, many years of learning, practicing, and developing. But when people see us, they see a guy with a camera and they just want to get a camera and they don't understand the process it took to become a photographer. On a personal level, could you sort of enlighten us about your own personal learning curve?
When I first started photography, of course, digital photography didn't exist in the consumer market, and so everything was shot on film. And the learning curve was quite steep, to be honest, because I could be quite creative and experimental, but then by the time I got my film back, I could never remember exactly what I'd done. And so there was quite a big distance between actually shooting and seeing the result and seeing what I'd actually managed to achieve with changing the settings on my camera or pointing the light in a different direction or whatever. Obviously, since digital's come along, you get much more instant feedback. And even though looking at the screen on your camera is not a perfect representation of the picture that you've taken, you can get some idea of what you've achieved and what your experimentation has done. And so actually with digital photography, it's been a lot easier, and I've managed to learn a lot more quickly. And of course, now that we have YouTube and online tutorials and things like that, it's made photography much more accessible and much easier for most people to get into. You do have to be careful which tutorials you look at and which channels you look at. Some people peddle some myths, and other people give really top-class information, which is very easy to find. So it can be a little bit tricky picking through what you find on the internet or in books these days. But actually, photography is now much more accessible than it ever has been, and is a much easier artistic pursuit.
It would be interesting to know, Adrian, what photographers do you admire and why?
It's a tricky question to answer. There are so many photographers whose work I really do like across a range of genres, but one of my favourites would have to be Frank Hurley, who accompanied Ernest Shackleton on his expedition to Antarctica. The expedition itself was a famous failure, and they got into a stage where they'd lost the ship they were in and had to camp on the ice for a number of months and then find a way of escaping. It's a wonderfully inspiring story, but one of the things that's amazing about it is that Hurley made sure that they brought as many of the glass photographic plates that he'd taken back from Antarctica, even though it was a massive effort to do so, because they showed such amazing things and taken in such harsh conditions. And to know that he was using a very large format mahogany camera with glass plates and developing them himself in Antarctica, despite all the problems that they faced, and also seeing the quality of his pictures and what they depict, they really are wonderful things to see. I also really like Steve McCurry. He's famous for his Afghan girl portrait that was on the front of National Geographic, as well as many other photographs, and also Arnold Newman, who was a portrait photographer who shot in black and white. But there are so many other names that I could add, like Andre Kertész and people that I've found on Flickr who don't seem to have real names but just have wonderful work, and lots of contemporary photographers too. So it's very difficult to choose my favourites, actually.
It amazes me that back in the day when they had film cameras and you're shooting with photographic plates, that they were able to capture so many great images with the equipment that they had. And now that we're living in the modern age, thank God for the modern age, that we have the modern cameras, not even film, we have digital cameras, and we're able to, I suppose, explore our creativity a bit quicker with the technology that we have. So let's go on from those that inspire you, and let's get back to you personally. When it comes to editing, do you enjoy it? And what is your software of choice when it comes to that process?
Yes, I do enjoy it. It takes more time than I'd like it to, and it's often difficult to find the time to sit down and edit as much as I'd like to. I try not to over edit my images, but there's often things that you want to do with curves and cropping and exposure and things like that, making sure that everything's the way you want it to be. But I do have a couple of techniques up my sleeve. One of the bits of software I use is Photoshop, and for my time-lapse things I use LR time-lapse and Lightroom. But I also do some old-fashioned wet photography. So I use platinum and palladium solutions and cyanotype solutions to sensitise my own paper, and then print my own negatives and do contact prints of them with ultraviolet light. That's a very different process from sitting in front of a computer using something like Photoshop, and I really enjoy the physical feeling of actually getting paper and turning it into photographic paper and making an image on that paper. Um, as I also enjoy using my printer and my computer for making images, but there is, I think, something still quite special about using some old-fashioned chemistry, and you do get some really wonderful results from it.
So I've shot in your studio, and it's lovely at the back of your house. But not everybody is fortunate to have a studio. What considerations have to be made when you're shooting outside as opposed to shooting inside or in a studio?
Yes, definitely. In a studio, you should have complete control over the lights, and it should be doing exactly what you want it to do. Obviously, outside you are at the vagaries of the weather, so you could have a cloudy day or an intermittently cloudy and sunny day, or all sorts of different qualities and directions of light. And so I think you have to be a little bit more on your toes and a little bit more flexible when you're shooting outside, and also a little bit more creative about it. If you want a light to point in a particular direction, or um, or you want a particular quality of light, it's very easy in the studio, but outside you do have to be a lot more on your feet and a lot more able to respond to the changes that you get in the light naturally. Yes, do shoot it. In all seriousness, sometimes we can't avoid shooting at that time of day, and so you do have to be aware of the direction and the quality of the light. And so you might choose some different style images. If you're shooting with a model, you might get him or her to lift their head up more so that there's less shadows under the eyes, or you may use something like a reflector, or stand in a place where the light is reflected such that you get a better quality of light on your model. But it's just all about understanding the quality and direction and what that's doing and what it is that you want to achieve with your photograph.
Before I started out in photography, I couldn't understand why people wasn't shooting in the midday sun. So, for the beginner and for the uninitiated, could you explain why it's better to shoot maybe in the evening or at sunrise?
Well, again, it all comes down to direction and quality of light. The sun's a lot lower in on the horizon, and so you're going to get a lot more light from the side generally than you are from the top, and that's generally more flattering. And also, you're going to get a different colour of light. The sun's shining through a greater amount of atmosphere, and so the light will tend to be warmer and less harsh. So you won't get those deep shadows, and you'll get a much more flattering light on many subjects. So they are good times of the day to shoot, but I still think that a good photographer should be able to use the light that they have to achieve good results no matter what that light is.
With your vast experience from shooting when you were 15, learning your craft, going out as a photographer, taking pictures in many different countries, shooting in your home studio, I'm sure you've come across a lot of advice, some good, some not so good. And as you know, it's all over the internet. I think YouTube is awash with good things, and it's a good thing, but there are some miscellaneous advice out there. So, from your personal experience, could you give three pieces of advice to a beginner photographer?
Yes, I would say first of all is shoot for you. Don't fall into the trap of making formulaic, samey pictures because someone on an internet forum has said you should always use the rule of thirds, or you should always light a particular way. Shoot what you want to shoot, and be creative within the bounds that you have, and try to make the art that you want to make rather than the art that somebody else tells you to make. The next thing I'd say is don't be completely obsessed by kit. You don't need to buy tons and tons of kit in order to be a good photographer. If you have one camera, one lens, then you can achieve wonderful things. And so learn to use the kit that you've got to its limits rather than trying to buy tons of kit to fulfill something that you may never do. Most photographers have got something that they've bought and put in a cupboard and never used, and actually it's much better to know how to use the equipment that you have, and you'll get much better photographs if you do that. The third thing I'd say in photography is that often less is more. You can apply this to a picture. So, for instance, if you have a very busy picture with a very wild background and a very detailed subject, it can get quite confusing to the viewer. And actually, sometimes just simplifying the composition is the best thing that you can do. Also, you can apply that to the amount of photographs you give somebody, or you supply someone, or you put on your own blog or website. Nobody wants to see 1,000 pictures that are basically all the same. It's much better to choose two that you really like and put those on. And so, actually, in photography, that motto it works so well. And touching on the previous point, it works quite well with kit as well. It's quite often better to take less kit and use it well than it is to take a huge bunch of things somewhere with you and leave most of them in your bag.
As always, with these kind of things, time is against us. But I want to give you a big, big thank you for your time and sharing your knowledge. I know that I have enjoyed speaking with you. I've enjoyed working with you, and I look forward to working with you again, maybe in the very near future, that I should come back down, or you can come up to the studio here in Birmingham and we can actually share some thoughts, share a coffee, and take a few photos. A big thank you also to the person behind your camera. She was very good.
Thanks for having me, Chris. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope I can appear on your channel again.
Look forward to seeing you, and stay safe and happy shooting. For those who want to know more about Adrian Anderson, his work would be somewhere in the description below. Thank you for joining us on the channel. Stay safe and, of course, happy shooting.